reasons. We realized it was a huge market. We realized most people love cereal. It's like a deep love that goes back to childhood. And if you could give people a cereal that is fun, that is joyful, that reminds them of being a kid again, and actually hits all the nutritional needs, then it could be a winning proposition and a really good business as well.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Gabi Lewis, co-founder and co-CEO of Magic Spoon. In this episode, we talk about building a better-for-you cereal brand. Gabi explains the journey from direct-to-consumer to in-store to omnichannel retail. Plus, we cover the do's and don'ts of influencer marketing, podcast advertising, and knowing when to launch new products. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by Jack Taylor, our exclusive PR partner. More than just PR, they're creative storytellers and brand builders who actually understand the health and wellness industry. To learn more, head to fitt.co/Jack Taylor. That's FITT.co/Jack Taylor. Hi, Gabi. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Excited to chat. I think most listeners will be, if they're listening to a podcast especially, they should be familiar with Magic Spoon. Hopefully some of them have tried it or seen it now, whether it's online or on the store shelves. But yeah, if they're not familiar either with you or maybe the brand, could you just give us a quick introduction and we'll jump into it from there?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Gabi Lewis, co-founder of Magic Spoon, and we make high protein, low carb, zero sugar breakfast cereal that tastes just like you remember. So think Fruit Loops, Lucky Charms, but packed with protein, keto, grain-free, gluten-free, whatever you want, we accomplish it. And ideally, it tastes like the sugary cereal from your childhood.
Yeah, I think playing into that nostalgia factor, right? Getting back to, maybe the cereals that weren't so, or definitely weren't so good for us growing up that I think all of us ate, and now trying to change that category. This is not your first go round in the consumer product space. And as it relates to health and fitness, I mentioned offline before we kind of jumped into this conversation, my knowledge of you goes back to you selling cricket protein and trying to change that industry. So maybe before we get into Magic Spoon, could you just set the scene in terms of maybe how you think about consumer behavior as it relates to food trends, and how you made that leap from cricket protein to now selling a better for you cereal?
Yeah, big questions. But just to zoom out, so I'm from Scotland originally, came to the US to study here at Brown, and in my senior year there in college, I basically heard of this idea of people eating insects, and it was written about in a few different places. The United Nations actually published a report, their most downloaded report in history, where they were talking about how if only we could get the West to eat insects for protein, then you could solve all of our problems with the food system. It's sustainable, it's high quality nutrition, high in micronutrients, very little water or feed required per pound of protein. And so me and my roommate at the time, who's now my business partner, we sort of heard this idea and we thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting, insects as food, but it also sounds really weird. How are you going to get people to actually do it? And a series of conversations later, we thought, well, it's really just a marketing challenge, right? If you can convince people that eating insects is not weird or gross, but in fact it's cool or even aspirational, then that could be a really interesting business that could also, change the world for the better as well. And so we ended up teaming up with a 3 Michelin starred chef who helped us develop this line of cricket-based protein bars. And we viewed them as this sort of Trojan horse introductory vehicle to get people into this idea of eating bugs and then potentially open it up as a major food source or protein source. And so we ran that business for about 5 years, ended up selling it about 4 years ago. Wanted to stay in the food industry, wanted to do something less niche than cricket protein. And what could be less niche than cereal? So we started this business about 4 years ago, and it's been a lot of fun since.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking about the shift potentially from food systems to better for you food to, what's more sustainable ultimately, right? From a production standpoint. And cricket protein is one of those things. Now we've kind of seen the manifestation of that in plant-based food. Is it going to be from plants? What plants? Mushrooms, maybe cell-based food. So that trying to crack that code is incredibly difficult, and I would say it's still going on today. I don't know that there's a good answer for it just yet, but certainly in terms of a bigger market, more accessible, and potentially a lot more fun, I feel like in terms of cereal, the branding, the marketing, everything that goes into that. When you started to even consider that category, was it a matter of just looking at the market and saying, look, it's so old, it's so tired, there hasn't been a ton of innovation, and certainly not as it relates to health and less sugar or keto? Or was it more from like a looking at consumer behavior and saying, oh, there's this shift in wanting to avoid sugar and wanting to live a healthier lifestyle, maybe some combination of those things? What was that kind of idea that led to the jumping off point?
Yeah, it was definitely all of the above. So on a personal level, I I like to eat healthy, but I find green juices not very enjoyable, and so like a few years ago, I thought I was sort of experiencing a similar thing to many people where you're trying to eat really healthy, and especially around breakfast time, there's all these pseudo healthy options. You can have a bar, you can have a shake, you have a smoothie, green juice, Greek yogurt, whatever it might be. None of them are fun, right? They're just like these joyless health products, and you can extrapolate out into the entire health food industry where it's a little bit less true today, but a few years ago, the whole health food world was very joyless, right? The packaging is just minimalist, bland, white boxes. You can see this more than anywhere in the cereal aisle, where until recently the cereal aisle is like separated on either side, where you have these colorful, fun, character-based boxes, and then you have these boring, bland, sad, like muted color boxes with a stalk of wheat and a fake farmer on the back, and it's just like it's going to be tasteless and not fun. And so we thought it could be interesting to sort of bring the joy back to breakfast, sort of in the healthy food industry at large, because it was so stark in cereal. And then from a more sort of like business analyzing the market standpoint, it was very clear to us that most categories were undergoing this evolution where at the very beginning, take a category like ice cream, for example. It's sugary, it's terrible for you. Then there's this next stage where someone comes along and makes it a bit more organic, a bit more simple ingredients. So there you've got like Ben and Jerry's using like organic milk and cream, Haagen-Dazs. And then you have this third wave, like the Halo Tops of the world, that they're not only making a better ingredients, they're more macro focused, right? Whether it's calories, protein, whatever the claim is, like focus more on the numbers. And we saw that in ice cream, we saw that in candy with Smart Sweets and various other brands, and you sort of see it throughout the grocery store. We weren't seeing it in cereal. And so we started asking people, why has nobody done this to the cereal category? And we got a few different answers, none of which were very satisfying. They tell us, oh, you can never get on shelf because Kellogg's and Mills control the shelf space. We knew from our prior business, if you build enough of a brand, then you can get on shelf. Or they'd say to us, nobody will ever pay more than $2 for a box of cereal. And obviously, if you want to make healthy cereal, it's going to cost more than $2. But again, you look around other categories, there's endless examples of products, whether it's food products or natural deodorant, pick your category. There's endless examples of something that's been 2 or 3 times the price in the store and ends up, doing very well if it can justify that price premium. And so we got all these reasons not to enter the cereal category. It's a declining market, whatever. Ultimately, we thought they were all pretty bad reasons. We realized it was a huge market. We realized most people love cereal. It's like a deep love that goes back to childhood. And if you could give people a cereal that is fun, that is joyful, that reminds them of being a kid again, and actually hits all the nutritional needs, then it could be a winning proposition and a really good business as well. So we went for it.
Yeah, even when we were talking about your previous company and shifting maybe consumer behavior or introducing a new product, you kind of said it was a marketing problem. And if you could solve the marketing piece of it, maybe you could then shift that behavior. Did you look at Magic Spoon the same way? Was it a marketing problem in terms of, getting people, maybe they wanted healthier cereal, but actually to purchase it and pay more, to get that shelf space, to break through in terms of customer awareness? Or was the marketing more so driven by that part that you talked about, like, hey, let's make it fun, let's play into nostalgia?
I actually almost view it the opposite from our last business, where this was not a marketing problem. This was a product problem. So in the cereal industry, like you've got to give it to the big cereal companies. They're really good at marketing. Like the cereal companies are some of the best marketers in the world. And looking back at cereal ads from like 30, 40 years ago, they're pretty good. And they've like really paved the way for us to lean into, marketing cereal in a way that creates nostalgia. We're sort of bringing modern marketing tactics to cereal, but we're not inventing characters in the box. We're not inventing fun colors, right? We're borrowing from the classics, sort of bringing it to the modern consumer and using modern tactics to do so. So for us, it was less about how do you market cereal. It was more about how do you actually make a cereal that the modern consumer wants. And by definition, cereal traditionally is just a box of cereal grains. And we wanted to create a cereal that had no grains in it and had very low carbs and had lots of protein. And so it was really how do we flip this product on its head entirely, but in a way that still meets what you expect from a taste and texture perspective. And so it was really a product problem to solve. And then once we figured that out, it was how do we sort of ride this line between leaning into classic cereal nostalgia but also doing so in an updated and modern and fresh way.
Yeah, I think all of these pieces are, in my mind, starting to build this framework that maybe it's the magic spoon framework, maybe it's just the broader, better for you CPG framework where it's identifying that category that's a little behind its time, needs updating in terms of, the marketing and the distribution channels and the awareness, certainly in terms of the branding and being healthier. When you then go out and right, you're launching as a direct to consumer product initially, are you thinking, hey, we need to establish this channel, build the brand, and then use that as our wedge into retail? And how quickly were you able to then make that jump to get into retail, now bringing with you all this awareness that you've kind of generated through these non-traditional channels?
Yeah, it's funny. When we launched, we didn't think we would be a D2C company. We launched thinking we're going to do D2C for a couple of months and get into retail as quickly as we can because at the time, no one was buying cereal online. I think at the time, like less than 1% of the cereal market was online. And so we didn't really even build a team that was like D2C experts even. Like my co-founder and I had some experience in it. We built our last business sort of 50-50 online, offline, but it was nowhere near the scale of this business. And so we launched and we instantly saw that it was just resonating online. The product market fit was far greater than even we expected. And obviously we had confidence in it, but we didn't expect the pool that we immediately got once we launched online. And it was so stark. There were influencers that we worked with from our last business that maybe if they did a post on Instagram, it would generate a couple of $1,000 sales. And then when they posted about Magic Spoon, it was 5 or 10x that. And so we instantly saw that all of these levers we knew how to pull were just far more effective than this business than our prior business. And so we decided to build this thing online for 2.5 years really before we went to retail. We realized that there was enough of a market online that we could build a business as big as we wanted to online. And the bigger we built it online, the more leverage we'd have for eventually going to retail. And so even though we were approached by retailers on like day two, basically, we said respectfully, not yet. We'll let you know when we're ready. And then we took a couple of years, and when the moment was right, we went very deep with Target on a nationwide rollout. That was about a year ago. And then in January of this year, we launched in Walmart, Kroger, Albertsons, Sprouts, and we're gearing up to launch into some more retailers now as well.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see that rollout and very intentional. I want to maybe circle back to what that looked like from influencers to then the rollout. But one question in terms of the category, and even as it relates to the D2C sales initially, and then who's making the purchase at the store, in my mind, especially a fun and colorful cereal, right? It screams like a kid product, right? It's for kids. It's for, that breakfast staple. But obviously, they're not the ones, with the purchasing power, and maybe they're not the ones who are even influencing what their parents are purchasing from that front. So, are you seeing like, hey, this is actually an adult, grown up cereal brand that kind of shifts that, or and if it is, then do you then try to make your way and back into it being the next generation of cereal brand regardless of age? Like how do you think about the demographic there?
It's a really good question. One of our slogans is childlike cereal for grown-ups. So we developed this with adults in mind. We didn't develop this to target kids. Uh, we, like many founders, we developed it sort of with ourselves in mind as kind of the customer we were going for. And the packaging at first glance looks like it's maybe for kids, but that's a nod to sort of the childlike element of cereal. And our characters are slightly more grown up takes on cereal characters. So they're a little bit psychedelic. one of our early investors actually didn't want us to launch with this packaging. I think he told us it looks like your designer, took mushrooms or something and then drew a sketch, and he was just like, it's too out there, but turns out it was perfect. It resonates, and so we're definitely targeting adults. Nevertheless, many kids eat our product, and I think for parents, it's amazing because they can sort of pretend to their kids maybe that it's actually sugary cereal, and the kids often don't realize, and so kids think it's like a delicious treat, but it's actually got no sugar and lots of protein. I think eventually we might consider backing into having a product that's geared towards kids. That would be a different formulation. I don't think, obviously depending on the age, but the average children's cereal maybe wouldn't need to have as much protein as our product does. Probably wouldn't be as concerned around carb intake, stuff like that. So it would be a different product that we would create if we were targeting kids. Right now, we're targeting sort of the kid inside you as an adult.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's spot on and just speaks to, reinventing or bringing new life into this category in a way that it was lacking for so long. Because if you did want something that tasted good, or if you did want something that kind of spoke to that taste palette, it's like it wasn't good for you. There was no other option. So it does definitely fill that void. And it also makes sense as it relates to some of the marketing strategies you mentioned, as you're launching from a D2C perspective, leveraging influencers. And as I was kind of reading up on this, doing a little research prior to, it reminded me a lot of how Thrive Market utilized influencers in the early days. I've had Nick on the show before and I've kept up with him a bit. And bringing them in, bringing influencers in beyond this, I'm sure affiliates and paying them super well was part of that strategy, but bringing them in as investors, leveraging their audiences, giving them upside, beyond that investment as well. Can you just talk about that maybe influencer playbook and to what extent it's still impacting the business? Because I feel like probably from launch, getting that initial burst and then momentum, it's probably much more impactful, but maybe what role does it play today?
Yeah, definitely. And I've got to give credit to Nick and Thrive Market for this playbook. So Nick and the Thrive founders are investors in our business, and they definitely, walked us through how to structure this kind of thing. And what we did was similar to what they did at their business, is brought in a lot of different, relatively small health and wellness influencers as investors in our business pre-launch. And so they would write checks anywhere from maybe 5 to 25 grand on average, and many of them had never really done angel investments before, but they've maybe made a fair amount of money recently just from being well-paid influencers. And they got early samples. They gave feedback on the product. It was an amazing way to get validation on the product and make sure that we were thinking about all the various attributes and trade-offs in the correct way for early adopters. And then they had a stake in the business. And when we launched, they were more than happy to promote. We made sure to pay them well as affiliates on top of their investment in the business. Many of them were able to make back their investment on the business from a single post. And so that's just win-win for everyone. And then they continue to promote. And now hopefully, eventually they'll see greater upside as well. I think it gave legitimacy to these influencer posts. It was obvious to anybody seeing it that they were not just being paid by a company they didn't know, but actually in our case, some of them helped develop the product and given input into where do we source our protein from, even in some of these cases. And so it was really amazing in the early days. I think you're right; it matters a little bit less now, but that's just the reality of a growing business, right? A post that generates $5,000 revenue on day one of a business is like the biggest celebration ever. Now it's not the biggest celebration ever, but it still helps. And so they're still an important part of our business today. We work with influencers of many different sizes now, and we have many different arrangements with them. But in the early days, it was this model of getting them to invest a small amount and then post and then pay them as affiliates as well.
Yeah, it's super smart and it it sounds very logical, very, almost obvious, but it is so much more difficult to execute, I think, in practice. There's a lot of brands, especially D2C brands, who come out and say, we were going to leverage influencers to do X, Y, and Z. Maybe they're even investors, but it doesn't actually play out that way. Beyond the learnings from Thrive Market, was there anything in particular that you can point to say, this is why it worked? Was it just a matter of the incentives being so aligned that, it was kind of a no-brainer and everybody felt that they were equal partners in it? Because it, like I said, it doesn't always play out that way. And yeah, I would just be curious to hear if there's any nuances of that influencer playbook that you can point to say maybe this is why it did work?
Yeah, I think one of the things is there's no silver bullet, and there's never going to be, unless you're going after mega influencers, which you're probably not going to get as a young brand. There's never going to be one post that like makes it work for you. And so we realized that at the beginning, and we didn't spend too much time with any single influencer or worry too much about any single influencer. So we got maybe 20 or 30 of them as investors in our business, and then worked with even more than that, in other ways early on. And so realizing that there's going to be 5 or 10 of them that really move the needle, you have no idea which those 5 or 10 are going to be. They're not going to be the ones with the biggest audience. They're not going to be the ones that like you the most. Oftentimes, you're not even talking to them. You're talking to their assistant or their marketing manager or whoever it might be. Like, you just can't predict it, but you need to really like overreach in the number of these people that you work with, knowing that some small fraction are actually going to deliver all the impact. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why we're able to make it work, because we just, went after a lot of them and worked with a lot of them. And so a few ended up working. And so the whole thing ended up working because of that.
Hey everyone, we'll get you back to the show in just a second. But first, I wanted to tell you about our exclusive PR partner, Jack Taylor. Honestly, this one's a no-brainer. We've known the Jack Taylor team for years. They work with some of the most innovative health and wellness companies. We're talking Whoop, Athletic Greens, Hyperice, and many more. Jack Taylor has an extensive industry network, knows how to work with high-growth companies, and really invests in building long-term relationships. I know this firsthand because they're Fitt Insider's PR agency, so I can confidently recommend them, and I do all the time. From startups to more established brands, they go beyond pushing product to help companies truly thrive. To learn more, head to fit.co/Jack Taylor. That's FITT.co/Jack Taylor. Now back to the show. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And then the other piece that I think was, at least where I gained initial awareness of it was through podcasts, and it felt like very early in that channel, and not only early, seemingly when it must have been working, right? Because when it did, and you had that awareness, it was like, we're pushing all our chips in here, and it's going to be across a lot of different podcasts. And now still hear it from time to time, but definitely not as much as I did maybe a year ago. I don't remember the exact timetable. What was the thought process around that tactic? Did you kind of at some point see, oh, this is moving the needle, and how has that channel evolved now, and maybe what percentage or how much are you putting towards like the podcast channel in particular?
Yeah, I mean, we viewed it as just as any other marketing channel early on, right? So we figured, we spoke to all the experts we could find that either ran podcast agencies or brands that have spent the most money on podcasts, and we figured out kind of best practices and tried to understand what is it going to cost to actually test this channel properly and see if it's going to work. And so we tested into different size shows, different genres. What we learned pretty early on is that all that matters really is a credible host that people trust. And so we view podcasts just as influencer marketing. So we actually didn't care what the genre was, which is a little bit counterintuitive. We realized for us, it actually doesn't matter if the podcast is about food or fitness or true crime. All that matters is the person talking has some credibility and the people listening like trust that person. And so we would just figure out like which of the podcasts where people are listening to it for the host, not for the content. And by and large, that like very simple framework, as long as the price kind of made sense from a CPM perspective, those two things combined, like price and like host driven, those two things were like sort of the simplest way to describe the podcast strategy early on. And it worked. And we were able to find shows that made sense from a direct response marketing perspective. And like we could actually attribute the revenue and like believe as much as we believe putting money into a Facebook ad converts, like we could believe the same was true with certain podcasts we were sponsoring. I think over time, podcasts, having the number of podcasts that what I just described is true of hasn't grown as much as our marketing budget has grown. And so podcasts have come down as a percentage of our overall marketing budget over time. We've just done a lot of the ones that we were seeing amazing returns from, and their audience growth is kind of tapped out. And so it's no longer one of our most efficient marketing channels, but it's still an important cornerstone of our overall marketing mix.
Yeah, it was really well put that podcast is essentially influencer marketing. And if you find the right person that has the authority, they're going to be able to convert. And so I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when marketers and founders and operators are thinking about how to leverage that channel, because I do think it's like most people at some point they're like, oh, we have to test this, we have to figure it out. Is it converting? Is it not converting? And that being able to look at that and trust in that kind of host is a good way to put it. Obviously now you kind of said it there that the marketing budget has grown, therefore the strategy overall has grown. And, this is kind of circling back to the move into retail. It did seem like it was, I'd say more often than not, what happens with a kind of smaller brand who's, maybe niche in the targeting around better for you or low sugar or keto. It's like, we want to get into, the smaller health store down the street because that's where everybody who loves these kind of products shops. You took a decidedly different approach with that, it seemed, and was like, hey, we want to be in Target and Walmart and everywhere, as many doors that we can get into, and bringing the momentum of this D2C business that you had built, all these channels that you had already leveraged. I guess A, was that the strategy? And B, was it seemingly as easy as kind of saying, hey, we have already built up, kind of proving it and winning that shelf space almost ahead of time with the interest in the brand and the awareness of the brand, so that when you did roll out, it worked, and it worked in the eyes of these wholesalers?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about why new brands go into, X small natural food retailer that seems like a sexy account to land, they do it either because they want to be like seen there and build up their brand and like get influencers to discover it there, or because they like feel cool with their products there, or they do it to build proof of concept to then get a bigger retailer to say, okay, you're ready for us. And both of those things we felt like we'd already accomplished, right? We already had influencers, we already had brands, like we already had that sort of, sexiness around our product and our brand. And we'd already proven that we could acquire like a lot of customers at scale that are mainstream customers. And so we'd sort of ticked both of those boxes with our online business. And so it didn't feel like we needed to take that step of going to like small regional natural food retailers. Instead, it felt like we'd sort of used online for what most people use that for and could just go to the larger retailers and launch nationwide. We're also going up against very large competitors in a very large market. And I want to win like there, right? Like I want to win at Walmart and Target, and I want to build the cereal company of our generation. And I don't think we're going to do that at like a chain of 5 expensive natural food stores, right? Like that's just the wrong place to focus. And in many times, it can take as much energy to get in there as it does to get into 1,000 Target stores. And so I think obviously, there's lots of different factors around how much funding a business is built, what their eventual goals are. But for us, it just made all the sense in the world to not get distracted by those smaller retailers and instead, go straight to the larger ones.
Yeah, really smart. And I think is playing out as the marketing and the overall business shifts as you get into retail and then more stores, you know, from a podcast read or from a Facebook ad, you mentioned it's very easy to track that conversion. You understand dollars in, dollars out, and what that means. How have the KPIs, how has the marketing budget and strategy shifted as you get into retail now, where you're like, are they buying it because they just saw it there? Did we do that? Did something else drive that? Like, how do you even account for that?
It's really hard. And I speak to so many founders trying to understand what the secret is, and nobody has the secret. I think we're able to talk to all of our customers online and understand like their move to retail, right? So that's like one side of it is, of people who discovered us through an ad or podcast, or whatever it might be, and then started buying us in Target or Walmart or somewhere else later, we're able to talk to them and understand their behavior. And to some degree, vice versa, right? If someone discovers us in a store and then moves over to online because we have more flavors online or we offer a better price with subscription online, we're also able to talk to them and understand like their journey of discovery. So that side of things is kind of easy. Obviously, for someone that discovers it in retail and keeps buying us in retail, that's much harder. And we're running a lot of tests right now to try and understand what is the effect of our online levers on the offline business. And there's no perfect way to do it, but we're running different geographies, different incrementality tests, things like that, to try and understand like if we 2x our Facebook ad spend in a certain region, what does that do to retail sales in that region? And these are the same kind of tests that we did a year ago when we launched on Amazon to understand what is our D2C advertising doing for our Amazon business. that's a much easier one to understand. And it's like a pretty clear correlation once we ran some tests. Like we know for every dollar we spend on a Facebook ad driving to magicspin.com, there's going to be X, dollars in revenue going to Amazon. And the same is true of influencers and podcasts and everything else. Retail a little bit trickier, but similar style of testing.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about all of the evolution of the business, but also all the levers that you can pull as you get into the different channels, be it Amazon or be it retail. And really at some point it's like, as the product is figured out, because you said initially it's like it's a product problem, and now you have this traction, and now it's this game of, hey, how do we put it where people are? How do we get it to convert when they see it? What I guess you're kind of reaching that point, at least in my mind, as somebody who's never operated a food or beverage business, but where it's like, okay, do we keep pushing, keep trying to max out these channels, see where we can get the best kind of distribution and conversion? It's like, and do we start to diversify the portfolio? Like, do we roll out the kind of single serve cereals, the bars, the granola, what have you? Where are you in thinking about like that diversification, and if and when you do introduce other products into the fold?
Yeah, our philosophy generally is to do as much as we can with as little as we can, right? So I would much rather have a $100 million business just doing cereal than an $120 million business doing five different categories. And so we're generally reluctant to do more things, and that's true of even selling channels, right? Like we waited a long time before going to retail because I wanted to really max out D2C growth and make sure we were making that as like big and as efficient as we could before we then went on to the next thing and not distracting ourselves with too many things. The same is true of our product portfolio. The cereal market is big enough that we don't need to launch into a bunch of other totally different categories anytime soon. Even though we're in the Targets and the Walmarts of the world, we're in Walmart, for example, we're in 1,800, right? So there's still a few more thousand Walmarts that we could get into and we will get into. Same with all of our other retailers. We're not every single Kroger, for example. There's more there. And likewise, even just cereal flavors. Most of our retailers, we have like a core of four flavors, but we can probably get to a six or an eight before there's diminishing returns. So there's a lot of growth there just with our current partners and current cereal. Then once you factor in all the other places that it might make sense for cereal to be, whether it's single serve cereals on an airplane or, like you said, like a cereal bar type product, there's lots of very closely adjacent cereal things we could do, as well as a lot more to do just with cereal before we ever have to go sort of beyond that like tight cereal type category.
I think that's a good takeaway too for other operators. This point around like, hey, don't get distracted with all these other, iterations on the product, or, diversifying what the product line is and all the different SKUs, which then just creates more headaches ultimately, until you feel very confident that you've maxed out what you can do from that core product offering.
Yeah, though I do think it's a luxury to have a category that's big, right? So if you're not launching in a category as big as cereal, most categories aren't, you won't have this luxury, right? Like there are many brands out there that once they get to 20, 30 million or even less, like they will have to do something different to keep growing. We very deliberately chose a very large category so we could build something big without getting distracted with other products.
Yeah. And then I guess the other point beyond maybe diversifying or thinking about the evolution of the product is, at some point thinking about how this business exits or what that like kind of liquidity event is. Obviously, when you have other huge, big food, big cereal, TM players, there's acquisitions across the board. And I think I would be surprised if they haven't approached you about something like that already to this point. But there are other founders, I think, especially in the better for you food and beverage space, who are kind of very adamant, like, we're not selling to big food. We're disrupting this category. We won't kind of go down this path. And then just get our products turned into whatever the sugary version of this thing is. I've seen it both from like the food side and also like the beverage, kombucha, low sugar, no sugar drinks. And then you have somebody like, I think, RX Bar comes to mind, right? Who was like, they certainly took that trajectory. It was like a $500-600 million exit, like very difficult to say no to that, no matter what your philosophy is on the space. How do you think about, you know, I guess the trajectory, repaying investors, how you want this brand and product to live on?
Yeah, so we've raised a fair amount of capital, which definitely puts us on a path and comes with certain expectations. It was a very deliberate decision. We, like you said, are going up against basically three huge cereal companies that will and now have try and rip us off, right? So there are now, there's big cereal co-versions of our product, probably four or five of them. There's startups doing similar things as well, and some of them launched at similar time as us. But now there's like four or five big company versions too. Um, and so we deliberately raised a fair amount of capital so that we can properly compete with those versions that were inevitably going to come. Right now, we're focused just on winning that, right? So we're focused on making the best possible healthy cereal we can and getting it into as many of the right places to sell it as we can. I think there is like a path for most successful CPG companies that typically is more likely to involve a strategic exit than an IPO or something like that. So that's certainly something that's on the cards for the future. That's not something that we dogmatically rule out and say we would never be open to. I think it's a little bit naive when people think that like that's just something that's going to suddenly ruin your product, ruin your brand. It's true that often they mess up. I think it's more messed up because of sort of hierarchical or like management reasons versus the product. If you look at RX Bar, it's pretty similar today than it was a few years ago. I have no idea how that business is doing compared to a few years ago, but if it's not in the same trajectory, I'd guess that's because of changes in management and stuff like that, rather than them like devaluing the product. But right now, we don't focus on that too much. We focus on just building the best business we can, and think we'll succeed if we stay focused on that.
Yeah, it'll be awesome to continue to watch that evolution and just think about, a multi-$100 million plus cereal business is pretty crazy. I'm sure, even going into it, knowing that was the goal, but then getting to that point where it's like, hey, these 3 or 4 brands who are part of $1 billion conglomerates, like this is their core business. So maxing that out is still a long way to go and huge upside.
Yep, 100%.
Maybe a couple more questions before we get you out of here. One, just being around, you mentioned, obviously some of those bigger brands and yes, some upstarts who probably had a similar vision as you, or whether they saw what you were doing or whether they already were down that path. But, all of these trends from keto to low carb to high protein, do you feel like there's any risk in that and leaning too far into some of these trends? And do you see that sales kind of mirror the peaks and valleys of some trends, maybe like a keto?
Yeah, there's definitely risk. We were very deliberate early on not to put the word keto specifically in giant writing on the packaging. We want to, I guess, ride the longer term underlying trends, right? So lower no sugar to us is a longer term underlying trend. Even low carb sort of is, whether it's called keto or something else, depending on the year. There's still like longevity with that general notion of trying to avoid carbs. But the word keto itself, much like the word paleo a decade ago, or Atkins before that, there's risk in tying yourself, of course, to that specific word or brand too closely. So we were careful to sort of um, almost diversify our claims amongst high protein, low carb, keto, grain free, gluten free. And we want to be the healthy cereal to anybody, regardless of what they care about. And so I don't think very many of our customers care about all those things, right? Maybe they're a parent who wants something low sugar for their kid, and the fact that it's high protein is like kind of a nice benefit, but they don't really care that much. Or maybe they're hardcore keto and like that's all they care about, and they don't care that it's grain free, whatever it might be. But we wanted to be the healthy cereal to anyone, regardless of which of those things they care about, both to maximize our potential market for this product, but also so there wasn't too much risk on any one claim, knowing that these claims do sort of swing back and forth in like very stark ways, right? If you look at how fat was the enemy and then just the best thing ever, and now no one's really sure, but it's somewhere in between for a minute.
Yeah, it's better than kind of across the board eating 50 grams of sugar for breakfast. So
Yeah,
whatever health claim, diet, whatever it falls into, check that one off the list and kind of appeal to everyone who's trying to be a little bit healthier.
yeah, 100%.
And then the last question, and maybe there's something that's top of mind and maybe not. So we'll see kind of where it lands. But in my experience, somebody who's a kind of multi-time founder, and especially in the food and beverage space, they're following things very quickly. And maybe there's kind of like a list, whether it's on paper or in the back of their mind, of like, hey, this is the other category, this is the other trend, this is the other thing that, maybe I would start if I already wasn't deep down the path with Magic Spoon, or this is something I'm interested in and talk to my friends about. Is there anything that comes to mind down that path that you're kind of looking at and like, oh man, this is super smart and somebody should do this, and I would do it if I already wasn't, deep in Magic Spoon?
Well, I can't reveal those exact ones. I guess some of the stuff there's definitely stuff that I'm interested in. I don't know if I'd want to do it myself. I think all the lab grown meat, lab grown fat stuff is fascinating to me. And I think, the debates around it, the debates around the ethics of it, the sustainability of it, whether how people are going to react to it, different kinds of people are going to react to it. I think that's all fascinating. And there's so much up in the air there. And I think that's going to become a thing at some point. And so I'm definitely tracking the various players working on all the different types of lab grown meat, lab grown fat, and that's super interesting. I think it's totally different from these like plant based meats that maybe like had a moment and now that sort of popped for various reasons. So that's super interesting to me. I think the non alcoholic space is really interesting. I'm not sure anyone's really cracked that, but somebody's going to. And I enjoy trying all the different products there, whether it's the Kin Spritz or Gia or any other number of products there that I think are all trying to scratch a similar itch of something that like feels like you're relaxing and kind of having a drink, but not really. So those are a couple of spaces that I think are fascinating to a lot of people. I think they're both spaces that are like super early in their journey, sort of similar to what I did prior to Magic Swim with insect protein, though they're a little bit more advanced than insect protein, and so they're interesting to watch for sure.
Yeah, we're keeping an eye on both of those. Yeah, certainly with the cell based meats just kind of getting the okay in the U.S. That expected for sure to see even more people jumping in there. And yeah, Athletic Brewing, I had Bill on the podcast and Mel from Gia, so it's super interesting to see how those things evolved, and certainly down this path of, you know, better for you, evolving with people who are thinking about their health and well-being more, and obviously Magic Spoon fitting right in there, so hence wanting to have this conversation. So yeah, just super grateful to get a chance to chat today. For anyone who's interested, maybe they've tried it, maybe they haven't, check it out, magicspoon.com. And then what stores, if you were to give them that kind of call to action?
Yeah, so magicspoon.com or on Amazon, or you can find it in Target, Walmart, Kroger, Sprouts, and Albertsons.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely be keeping up with how things continue to evolve. Thanks for making time today.
Thanks for having me.
One more thing before you head out: help us spread the word. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, or share this episode with a friend. And if you like conversations like this, you'll love the Fit Insider newsletter. We send it every Tuesday. The link is in the description. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you back here next week.